He opened the Koran with the intention to tear it apart to prove it wrong in front of the world, but what he didn't expect was that the words would tear him open instead. There's something wild about truth. It doesn't need to scream, it doesn't need to fight, it just is, and when you go looking for it, thinking you're gonna tear it apart, expose it, break it down, sometimes what actually happens is you get broken. That's what happened to this guy. He didn't believe, not even a little. He picked up the Koran not with curiosity, not with respect, but with a mission to disprove it, to tear it apart. Word by word, verse by verse, he was ready with highlighters, notes, arguments, videos, history books, everything, but somewhere in the middle of that mission, something changed. He was reading it like an opponent. But the words didn't come at him like a weapon. They spoke to him like a whisper, like something was being said to him, not at him, and he fought it. You could see him fighting it. You could see it on his face. In his voice, every time he hit record, it was like he was trying to keep a wall up, trying to stay the skeptic, trying to be the tough guy who says, this is all nonsense, but his eyes told a different story. You could see the cracks forming, the moments where his voice would shake, the long silences between reading a verse and responding to it, the way he'd pause like the words hit something deeper than logic. Something primal, something real, and one day, he just couldn't hide it anymore. He broke down, right there, on camera, not because someone convinced him, not because of some dramatic debate, but because he saw something pure and it wrecked him. It's not about religion, it's not about culture, it's not about proving someone else right or wrong. It's about what happens when truth hits you when you expect to dissect a book and instead, that book dissects you. It asked him questions he didn't have answers to. It called out parts of him he'd buried. It didn't care about his arguments, his followers, his pride. It went deeper than that. It went straight to the soul. And you can fake a lot of things online, but you can't fake that kind of break. Tears don't lie. This wasn't about losing an argument. This was about surrendering to something bigger than your ego. Bigger than your doubts, bigger than anything you ever planned on feeling when you hit record. He thought he was going to prove it wrong, but somewhere in that journey, he found something that proved him wrong. And sometimes that's exactly what you need, not answers, not applause, just that one quiet moment when the noise dies, and something real speaks to you, and if you're brave enough to listen, it might just change everything. There's something wild about truth. It's not always loud. It doesn't have to argue. It just sits there, calmly, quietly, unshaken, and waits for you to stop talking. It doesn't care about your background, your agenda, your pride, or your platform. Truth doesn't need validation. It doesn't chase you, but when you go chasing it for the wrong reasons, thinking you're going to prove it wrong, that's when it does something strange. It flips the whole script. Because you thought you were the one doing the dissecting, but it turns out it's dissecting you. And that's what happened with this guy. He wasn't coming from a place of openness or humility. He came in with fire. Determination. He was locked in, focused, ready to go verse by verse through the Koran and pick it apart, and he didn't hide it. He was loud about it. He thought he had the tools, the intellect, the arguments, the research. He thought he was going to expose contradictions, find holes, break it apart, and show his audience that it was just another book, just ancient text with no relevance or truth. But what he didn't realize was that this book wasn't like anything he'd ever read before. It didn't argue with him, it didn't plead with him, it didn't demand anything from him. It just sat there, and it spoke, and the words, they didn't shout, they echoed. He'd read a verse and expect to feel smug or confident, but instead he found himself sitting with it. Longer than expected, questioning it, yes, but also feeling something. That's the part he couldn't explain. It wasn't just information, it was connection, and it scared him. You could see the tension in his videos. The first ones were sharp, aggressive, almost performative, but then there was this shift. Small at first, a hesitation here, a longer pause there. The way he'd read certain lines and look away for a moment. The way his voice would catch like something was happening inside that he couldn't quite control. It was no longer a debate. It was no longer about logic or trying to win an argument. Something deeper had been activated. He was being moved not by emotion, not by pressure, but by the weight of something that didn't need to explain itself, and it broke him. It actually broke him, not in a dramatic way, not in some emotional breakdown that you see on social media for views. This was different. This was raw, real, honest. This was a man sitting alone, reading something he thought he'd destroy, and suddenly realizing he was the one being exposed. His own assumptions, his own wounds, his own defenses, they were being stripped down. Piece by piece, and he didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't expecting the Koran to talk back, but it did, not with sound, with stillness, with questions he couldn't shake, with verses that felt like they were written just for him. And that kind of thing, it doesn't come from outside, that's an internal earthquake. It shakes up your identity, your beliefs, your understanding of what's real and what matters, and you can't fake that. You can't rehearse that. When you see someone fighting back tears on camera, when their voice trembles and their hands shake, that's not performance, that's something sacred happening, something they can't even put into words. He started out confident, almost smug. You could tell he thought this was going to be easy, another book to criticize, another ideology to break down. He had done it before with other belief systems, other scriptures, other people's sacred texts. And he thought this would be no different, just another outdated manual of rituals and commands that he could deconstruct with logic, history, and science. But the moment he opened the Koran, something felt different. It wasn't just a book of rules, it was speaking in a voice he hadn't expected, direct, unfiltered, unapologetic. It didn't feel like it was trying to prove anything, it just was. The tone, the weight, the presence of the words, it was like the book was alive in its own way. Like it was aware of who was reading it, and he noticed that early on. You could see it in the way his expressions started to change. At first, he'd stop after each verse and try to critique it. He would challenge the grammar, the ideas, the claims. But slowly the commentary got quieter, the pauses got longer. He would read a verse, then stare into the page, almost like something invisible had grabbed his attention and wouldn't let go. It wasn't that he was losing the debate. It was that he was starting to realize there wasn't going to be one. The Koran wasn't arguing with him. It was addressing him, as if it knew every counterpoint he'd been preparing before he even turned the page. There's a strange kind of silence that happens when someone reads something that cuts through their defenses. It's not the silence of boredom or confusion, it's the silence of being seen. He thought he was reading the Koran, but he started feeling like it was reading him. The words weren't just historical or poetic, they were personal. They spoke to the ego, the heart, the wounds he carried. It was unsettling. He'd never read a book that didn't seem to care about proving its worth. The Koran didn't try to win him over, it confronted him. It spoke of the human condition in a way that was uncomfortable because it was so precise. It described doubt, fear, arrogance, regret, repentance. It talked about the soul like it was something real, something weighty, something that couldn't be ignored, and he kept reading, day after day, not because he wanted to anymore, but because he couldn't stop. There was a gravity to it. Something kept pulling him back to the page, even when he didn't understand everything, even when he didn't want to believe what it was saying, and then came the moments he couldn't hide. The voice shaking, the eyes watering, the sudden loss of words. This wasn't a man being defeated in debate. This was someone confronting a truth he didn't know how to explain. And it wasn't just the theology or the stories. It was the feeling. The way the Koran would shift from speaking about nations and prophets to suddenly calling out the reader like it knew who you were, where you came from, what you've been through, and what you pretend not to feel. You don't prepare for that. You don't expect a book to speak like that. He went in thinking he was going to stay detached, objective, analytical, but what he got was something spiritual, emotional, maybe even supernatural. The more he tried to keep his guard up, the more the verses seemed to find cracks in his armor. He tried to resist, you could see it, the effort to stay composed, the intellectual pride, but his humanity kept slipping through. He wasn't reading to expose anymore. He was reading because something inside him had been touched, and he didn't know what to do with that feeling. There's a certain kind of tension that lives in a man who walks into something thinking he's got all the answers. He carries this invisible armor, built from years of skepticism, pride, and control. He thinks he's ahead of the game, like no idea can surprise him, no belief can shake him. And that's exactly how he approached the Koran, not like a seeker, but like a hunter. He had watched debates, read articles, followed threads where people dismissed faith as outdated or irrational. He had a mental checklist of arguments, a ready-made defense against anything that smelled like religion. So when he picked up the Koran, he didn't expect to feel anything. In fact, he was sure of it. He believed the only thing he would walk away with was more proof that faith was an illusion, and that sacred texts were just old cultural relics. But something happened almost immediately that he wasn't prepared for. The tone of the book wasn't what he expected. It didn't beg to be understood. It didn't start with a disclaimer or a justification. It opened with authority, with clarity, and more than that, it opened with purpose. He found himself reading verses that didn't just talk about events or laws, they talked about him. His doubts, his questions, his private thoughts, the ones he never said out loud, the ones he laughed off with sarcasm, but never really dealt with. It was like the book was holding a mirror up to the parts of himself he usually kept hidden behind intellect and confidence, and that shook him. You could tell, in his first recordings, he tried to mask it. He'd read a passage, and then launch into his critique like he'd planned. But the rhythm started breaking. He'd stumble over certain verses, not because the words were hard, but because they hit hard. He was experiencing something that didn't fit neatly into logic. The Koran didn't just challenge his mind, it unsettled his soul. It spoke in a language deeper than words, and that terrified him. He wasn't ready to feel. He was ready to argue, but there was nothing to argue with when the book just kept reaching deeper and deeper into him. His reactions told the story, his tone changed, his posture changed, the fire in his voice softened. His responses became slower, more reflective. There were moments he'd stop mid-sentence, caught in the space between belief and denial. He wanted to refute, but he was being disarmed, not by anyone else. Not by pressure, just by truth, a truth that didn't need to prove itself because it had already taken hold of something inside him that he couldn't explain. And then there were the tears, that moment when he couldn't hold the weight of what he was reading anymore. Not because he was overwhelmed by emotion, but because the depth of what he encountered exposed how shallow his expectations had been. He thought he'd destroy this book with intellect. Instead, the book quietly pulled him into a kind of awareness he hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. The tears didn't come from sadness, they came from recognition, from confronting something that finally made him feel real, seen, known. Like all the noise in his mind had been turned down just long enough for something eternal to speak directly into him, and in that space, he wasn't a skeptic, or a critic, or a commentator. He was just a man sitting alone with words that didn't echo, they penetrated. And the way he looked at the camera after that moment, the way his eyes searched for something to hold onto, that was the face of someone who had touched something sacred and didn't know how to walk away from it. He didn't go in searching for peace. He went in searching for proof that it wasn't real. That's what made it so raw. He wasn't hungry for guidance. He was hungry for confirmation that all of it, the prayers, the recitations, the belief in something unseen, was all just made up. He wanted to come out the other side with a smile on his face and a mic drop moment. He thought he was going to win. That was the game plan. Sit down, go through the Koran slowly, pick it apart, expose the inconsistencies, laugh off the teachings, and show his audience how easy it is to dismantle faith when you have logic and confidence. But it didn't go that way. Not even close, because the moment he started reading, something inside him shifted just a little at first. Maybe he didn't even notice it. A subtle stillness crept in, the kind that you only feel when something ancient and unchanging enters your space. He was used to debates, to noise, to distraction, to always having something to say, but this book didn't argue back, it didn't fight for attention, it didn't meet his challenge with hostility, it just was. The tone was firm, unwavering, and above all calm, not the kind of calm that puts you to sleep, the kind of calm that pierces through all the chaos in your mind and forces you to sit with yourself. He kept going, verse after verse, page after page. He was still in denial, still holding on to the belief that he was in control. But the words weren't letting him off easy. They started revealing things he hadn't prepared for. Descriptions of the human soul, warnings about arrogance, stories of people who thought they had all the answers, and every time he read one, it landed a little closer to home. It stopped feeling like some ancient book written for a different time. It started feeling like it was written for him. That's when the real battle began, not between him and the Koran, but between him and his own reflection. He tried to brush it off. He tried to stay analytical. He even tried to laugh at certain verses just to keep the wall up, but it was clear something was breaking inside. You could see it in his posture, in the way his voice began to crack at unexpected moments. It's a strange thing when words start pulling memories out of you, memories you thought were buried, regrets you thought you'd forgotten, doubts you've never admitted out loud. That's what this book was doing. It wasn't trying to impress him, it was uncovering him, slowly, relentlessly, gently, and then came that moment, the one he didn't plan for, the one he never saw coming. He was reading a verse one that spoke about hearts that find rest in the remembrance of something higher, and he just stopped. No commentary, no joke, no reaction, just silence, and then tears, not dramatic, not performative, just real. His face shifted, the pride melted. The camera kept rolling, but he wasn't performing anymore. He wasn't trying to win. He was just sitting there, face to face with something deeper than anything he'd ever known. Something that didn't need his approval to be true. It had already proven itself by reaching the part of him that words usually couldn't touch. What broke him wasn't the logic or the structure. It wasn't the fear of being wrong. It was the realization that something had always been there, waiting for him to slow down long enough to feel it, and in that moment he wasn't a skeptic, he wasn't a critic, he wasn't a content creator. He was just a human being, vulnerable, cracked open, and exposed by something timeless, so maybe the truth isn't always loud. Maybe it doesn't need to convince you, it just needs you to be quiet long enough to feel it. And when it finally hits, not in your head but in your heart, that's when everything changes.